Benvenuto a tutti a questo primo incontro.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning to the first meeting of the series What Awakens the Human, set of 4 meetings. Together with us, we have the honor of having Professor Wu, who is a professor at the Peking University teaching philosophy. Hui, his wife, is with him, and by the way, they are celebrating the 10th anniversary of their wedding during these very days. My name is Tobias Hoffmann, and I am Associate Professor of Medieval Philosophy at the Washington University. 2 years ago, I got invited to a conference on freedom and responsibility in medieval philosophy at the Peking University. As you may very well imagine, I was a bit taken aback by the fact that in China there would be somebody interested in medieval philosophy. And I'm referring to Latin philosophy with St. Augustine and Aquinas. The conference took place last year, and the organizer was Tianyue. I was very impressed, not only by the quality of his paper, but I was very much impressed by his openness of mind, and especially by the fact that he told me quite freely that he was a Catholic. Now, to put it briefly, you could see at once that Tianyue was an exceptional person. So I desired to have him invited to the meeting of Rimini precisely because of what the meeting is. An extraordinary opportunity for meeting people who share an aspiration to an ideal. Now, before giving him the floor, I'd like to say that the most surprising thing is that in China, you would have somebody interested in the origin of our Western culture in a way that we have quite lost ourselves in the West. The study of ancient Greek and the study of Latin are increasing. Not only is there an interest to the ancient roots of our culture, but there are many non-believers as well in China who are interested in medieval history or Christianity. Some see in Christianity a resource to support the Chinese culture. There is even talk of some theology of modernization, i.e. a secular approach to Christianity. Others have a genuine interest in Christianity as such. Thus, centers for Christian studies are born even at state universities. In the Wuhan University, for example, which is one of the most important universities in China, there's a Center for Studies of the Philosophical and Theological Thought of Thomas Aquinas. Now, with reference to this interest in Christianity, I'd like to refer to you about a discussion that I had with a student at the Peking University. He told me he was studying Latin and medieval history because he was interested in better understanding the origin of the West. Even to understand why, at some point in time, Western culture surpassed Chinese culture. And he asked me if it was worth studying the history of church as well. That is, he asked me whether to understand Western culture, it would have been useful also to study the history of the church. And he said to me quite clearly that he was not a Christian. Well, that surprised me a lot, because who would raise such a question in the Western world? Indeed, it did strike me because a Western intellectual would say that in order to understand the culture, you would have to study Francis Bacon, Descartes, Isaac Newton, and so on and so forth. In other words, a Westerner would say that the West was born or maybe was reborn with enlightenment. But as the French philosopher Rémi Brague said, and he's also a friend of the meeting as he visited the meeting himself, so as Rémi Brague said, in order to understand Europe, you have to get out from it so as to get in the right perspective. Well, the Chinese student, that Chinese PhD student, understood better than we do what lies at the very basis of our own culture in the West. So even today, meeting up with Tianyue, we are given the opportunity to get to know a person coming from a faraway country that very many of us do not know. And as we shall see, he is a person who's very close to us. Tianyue will talk about his journey of faith, setting it against the background of the Chinese history and culture as a professor of philosophy.
Buongiorno. I apologize for not being able to speak Italian. First off, thanks a lot for the kind words of Tobias. I also want to extend my gratitude to the organizers for inviting me to give a talk at this exciting meeting. It is a great honor and pleasure for me to share my experience of faith with you. I was born in a small town and grew up in a Catholic family. I received a good family education and was admitted to one of the best universities in my country. After obtaining a PhD degree with a thesis on St. Augustine from a Catholic university abroad, I'm now teaching ancient Greek and medieval philosophy at the university from which I have graduated. There is nothing special about this, but probably with one exception. It involves a distant country called China. Made in China is already everywhere. However, the combination of Catholicism and China is still mysterious for many people, whether Chinese or foreign. Even though there are at least 6 million Catholics living in China today. But I have to say the exact figure is still a myth. Therefore, I will tell a story about being a Catholic in China to shed some new light on this mysterious combination of China and Catholicism. My talk consists of 2 parts. First, I will say a few words about the condition of religious faith in China to show the real challenges and opportunities for being a Catholic in China. Then I will return to my personal response to the status of emergency to cite the theme of our meeting in this entirely different culture. What does it mean to be a Catholic in China? In my opinion, it means above all to lead a religious life in a secular society. We, both you and I, live in a secular age. This does not mean that religious faith does not have a place in our societies, but rather that religious beliefs are no longer taken as unchallenged and absolute truth. In other words, religions can still play significant and irreplaceable roles in our society. But the conditions of religious faith have radically changed. In a secular age, what we have is only the life here on earth, and nothing more. All religious belief in the transcendent should be understood or even justified in terms of immanent values of this world. For instance, churches are permitted to exist just because they are useful for maintaining social stability. Given that some people have not entirely adopted a fully secularized worldview, with this global phenomenon of secularization in the mind, I will mention three fundamental elements in modern China: our long tradition of secularity, the ascetic ideology, and the market-oriented economy. This will show how secularity has become the main challenge to Catholic belief in contemporary China. In a manner quite different from the way it is in Western societies. The process of secularization began rather early in China, in that religious beliefs in a transcendent God exercised little influence on social and moral life in ancient China. We do have a few scattered and ambiguous records testifying to the presence of primitive religions in ancient Chinese society, especially the worship of the Lord of Above, 上帝 in Chinese, and of heaven, 天, a religious practice which can be traced back to the 2nd millennium BC or even earlier. Yet, it was the 6th century BC, the axial age in China, when Confucianism and Taoism emerged, that decisively shaped the culture and outlook of the Chinese people. At that time, China was divided into more than 100 feudal states, which warred against each other. In this period, what concerned the greatest minds was primarily how to establish moral and political order. It is well known that Confucius always exhorted his followers to respect spiritual or supernatural beings, but also to keep aloof from them, because he believed that the duties of a virtuous person had nothing to do with God or gods. Lao Tzu, the great teacher of Tao or the Way, also insisted that the mission of the sage was to follow the inherent law of nature in his political activities. The idea of a transcendent being serving as the foundation of human values was entirely foreign to Confucius and his contemporaries. In the 2nd century BC, Confucianism became the predominant ideology of the imperial society. Confucianism lays an extremely strong emphasis on living a life centered on li, or ritual. As with most important Chinese concepts, it is rather difficult to translate li or give it a precise definition. In the Confucian tradition, li is not only concerned with the rites and the ceremony of worship, especially ancestor worship, but also with respectful manners, social customs, and even laws. It is quite close to the ancient Greek conception of logos. Central to li are the uneven relations between subjects and the sovereign. Which are conceived on the model of family relations between father and son, or husband and wife. These family relations provide the moral and the ritual principle on which the political order is based. It was believed that only a fixed set of behavioral codes, such as loyalty, 忠, and filial piety, 孝, could bring society into a harmonious state. Now, it is not difficult to see why Confucianism was so popular among Chinese emperors. Because it emphasized worldly considerations and social stability. This conservative emphasis was further institutionalized by the later dynasties, and its core values and their physical expressions, for example, ceremony of ancestor worship, remained unchallenged for almost 2,000 years. When two great Italian Jesuits, Matteo Ricci from Macerata and Michele Ruggieri from Bari, arrived in China in the 16th century, they immediately realized that moral teaching focused on this life here on earth, and that this world was of first importance to the Chinese. They endeavored to adopt the Chinese language and the culture when preaching Christianity. Unfortunately, their efforts were badly disrupted in the Chinese rights controversy at the end of the 17th century. The Jesuits believed that some participation in traditional Confucian ceremonies was compatible with Christian faith. They see them as a ritualized show of respect for ancestors. Others disagreed, however, and they convinced the Pope, who then prohibited Christians from attending traditional Confucian ceremonies, such as the seasonal rites for honoring Confucius or ceremonies of ancestor worship. eventually Pope Pius XII reversed this decision in the 20th century. However, as a return for the Pope's prohibition in 17th century, Chinese emperors banned any Christian mission in China until the 1840s. In the middle of the 19th century, Confucian beliefs themselves ran into deep crisis when China was forced by the Opium Wars to protect Christianity and open itself to foreign trade. Whether intended or not, preaching Christianity became integrated into the European colonization of China. Meanwhile, due to the Opium War, Confucian followers had to face the failure of Confucianism to preserve secular prosperity. The failure of Confucianism finally brought about the end of imperial government in China. At the beginning of the 20th century, Chinese nationalists became disillusioned with traditional Chinese culture and launched the New Culture movement in 1919. They sharply criticized the Confucian way of life and the traditional values, and tried to replace it with Western conceptions of democracy and science. However, this did not mean that Christianity would be welcomed as an essential part of Western culture. On the contrary, what followed was an anti-Christian movement in the 1920s, which rejected Christianity as outdated superstition. In other words, after stepping out of the highly secularized traditional society, most of Chinese intellectuals immediately embraced the goals and values of Western secularization. The anti-Christian movement abruptly came to an end in 1929. With the baptism of Jiang Jieshi, the chairman of national government of China. However, the early unsympathetic attitude to both Confucius and Christ was inherited by the communist government, which came into power in 1949. The new government assumed atheism, the second element of the secularization in China, as an essential part of its ideology. The new government regarded all religions as the opinions of the people. The first 30 years of the People's Republic of China saw the hardest time for Christianity in mainland China, especially from 1966 to 1976, in the 10 years of the Cultural Revolution. In that time, foreign missionaries were expelled, church closed, and priests forced to take secular positions. All religions suffered the same fate during the Cultural Revolution. But it was more serious in the case of Christianity, because it had long been considered a foreign religion. Fortunately, the government decided to launch a policy of economic reform and modernization in 1978, which is better known as the policy of reform and opening up. This new policy also called for religious toleration, and the churches were therefore reopened in 1979, the year I was born. Since then, Christianity has grown swiftly with the rapid economic development of the last 30 years. According to recent government estimates, the total number of Chinese Christians, including both officially registered and underground churches, is around 30 million, of which 6 million are Catholics. During the last 30 years, the policy of reform and opening up brought about rapid economic growth. The economic growth has been more and more affecting the spiritual life of Chinese people. This is a great period of transition. The old systems of values have been severely damaged, while the new ones have not yet been established or are limited in what they can do. Now, many Chinese people are losing their faith in the secular norms. Instead, they are adopting an even more utilitarian and cynical attitude toward life in such a rapidly changing society. Carpe diem has become their motto. The mismatched growth of economy and the decline of spiritual life has led to an emergency of humanity in China. Many people do not and cannot find a way to regain human dignity in this secular world. The challenges for being a Christian in contemporary China are now evident. One has to cope with the non-tradition of secularization. The atheist ideology and the blind economic growth. First of all, a Chinese believer needs to take a critical view of her own cultural background. And to cut off those elements that are incompatible with Christian belief. This means that she has to face the danger of being singled out in a highly secularized society. Moreover, she should demonstrate the superiority of Christian life by her own thoughts, deeds, words, and deeds. Yet, one does not live in vacuum, but rather one is born to be a social animal. A Christian believer cannot and should not entirely detach herself from the secular society. Otherwise, her witness would remain completely invisible and have little effect upon those who do not yet have any interest in transcendent realities. In other words, she has to open herself to the secular world without falling prey to its zeitgeist. This is particularly important for Chinese Catholic believers because they often adopt a rather conservative attitude towards the outside world and make little effort to actively defend themselves in front of the challenges posed by their cultural circumstances. Their silence and retreat from the world merely makes the church invisible to outsiders. For all the challenges faced by Chinese Christians, the difficult conditions also offer great opportunities. The fact that there is actually no predominant atheists in China makes Christian ethics more attractive. More importantly, China's heritage and the skeptical attitude of the mainstream society force Chinese Catholics to reflect more deeply upon their beliefs and their traditions. They force them to develop a strong sense of self-consciousness. Without doubt, these challenges and opportunities have shaped the growth of faith in my life. I will now speak in the remainder of my talk. I was born in Anshun, a small town in Guizhou, a province in the southwestern part of China. In 1644, following the death of the last emperor of the Ming Dynasty in Beijing, some of the royal relatives established small dynasties in the southern provinces of China. One of them, namely Emperor Yongli, later took refuge in Guizhou, in my hometown. Yongli's court had close associations with the Catholic Church. Both the emperor's mother and wife had been baptized. It is said that there were 40 Catholic ministers and secretaries in the royal court. This was the first appearance of the Catholic faith in Guizhou province. However, it soon died with the short-lived Yongli dynasty. The evangelization of Guizhou was resumed by the Mission étrangère de Paris in the middle of the 19th century. My great-great-grandfather belonged to the first generation of Catholics in Anshun. My grandfather studied at a high school run by Catholic missionaries. He thought about becoming a priest. Unfortunately or fortunately, a bad headache forced him to return home, and later he went to a medical college. The Catholic faith remained as an essential part of my family tradition. Even so, I had been skeptical of this faith when I was a child. At that time, my grandfather was badly ill, and my parents had to work very hard for the whole big family. All my religious education came from my grandmother. She is an old-fashioned housewife, extremely nice and pious, devoting all her life to the family. But unfortunately, she did not know how to read. Even worse, the prayers she taught me were written in an idiosyncratic style, mixing literary and colloquial language. Furthermore, due to the separation from the Roman Catholic Church, the Chinese Church celebrated Mass exclusively in Latin until the 1990s. The Mass and these prayers were more like a torment than a help for a child who had begun to be curious about the faith. Last but not least, the few isolated phrases I had heard from my grandfather and the priest came into direct conflict with what I had learned at school. In China, we all grew up with the song of l'Internationale. Il n'est pas de savoir suprême, les dieux, les chasseurs, les tribuns. There are no supreme servile, neither God, nor Caesar, nor tribune. In the textbook, we were told that all religions are nothing but superstitious beliefs that belonged to a dead past. As a result, the religious faith often singled out one as a lion or monster. I still remember well the reactions of my classmates when I wore a cross. The wind blows where it pleases. You can hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. I heard God's words, but did not know their messages. The secular circumstances forced me to seek for a clearer understanding of my faith. I did not want to assume it just because it had been a part of my family. Once I asked my parents to show me where God is. They failed, and brought me to Father Zhong, the priest of our town, a classmate of my grandfather in the missionary school. He did not say much, but showed me some pamphlets about faith and science, which collected famous quotes like, "Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind," by Albert Einstein. You know, the Chinese people held scientists and their words in greatest respect, with deep belief in their capacity to improve life in this world. However, at the time when I read the pamphlets, I was not fully convinced by the citations, because they lacked any further explanation. Nevertheless, they did enkindle my curiosity about how a scientific approach to the world could be compatible with a sincere belief in a transcendent being. The crucial moment of my way to faith came rather unexpectedly. My grandfather passed away when I was 14. Filial piety occupied a central place in Chinese traditional ethics. Our family, though Catholic, was no exception. That was also the first time I experienced the departure of those closest to myself. I asked to be excused from school and stayed in the church with the body of my grandfather for 3 days and nights. Father Zhong had adopted around 20 children of various ages, some of whom later became seminarians. I heard them praying and singing from morning to night. The obscure phrases of prayer suddenly became accessible to me. De profundis clamavi a te, Domine. Requiem aeterna dona eis, Domine. Et lux perpetua luceat eis. I was deeply moved by the emotional power of their prayers, resonating in that small stone building. The peace of mind I felt in those days helped transform the inherited family tradition into my own faith. It came closer to my heart because I began to believe that only this peace of mind can reveal the mysterious meaning of death and life, which was so close but had remained hidden to me. I was not afraid and doubtful any longer, because He is with me and gives me strength. Faith seeks understanding. I began to read the Bible and theological works like Augustine's Confessions, John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, almost everything about Christianity I could find in our small town. For some time, I had been hesitating between choosing science and philosophy as my career. Science, in particular biology or medicine, seemed more promising and had strong support from my parents. Another tradition of my paternal family is medicine, both Western and Chinese traditional medicine. My great-great-grandfather, my late grandfather, my uncle, and my father were all medical doctors. They believed that this practice was one of the best ways to help those in need and to glorify God. Nevertheless, I opted for philosophy with Abigail's idea. To heal the soul by philosophy was as important as to heal the body by medicine. At that moment, I was fascinated with the belief that only philosophy as love of supreme wisdom could save China from its moral degeneration. What underlay these beliefs was curiosity about the truths revealed in the Bible. No matter how naive my ideas were in high school, I have always been grateful that my faith brought me to the discipline of philosophy. In China, all high school students need to take a tough national entrance exam for admission to the university. Peking University is the oldest one and ranked number 1 in China in various ranking systems. Therefore, only the very best in the entrance exam can be admitted. I was very lucky to be the first in my province and had no difficulty of being admitted to the Department of Philosophy. Unlike Western universities, we had to declare our major before being admitted. To my surprise, I found only 2 of my classmates had taken philosophy as their first choice. Others came to philosophy just because they had been rejected by other departments. For most people flooded into the faculty of law, management school, economics, which seemed to promise an easy success in this secular world. Therefore, at that time, only few students in the Department of Philosophy were really interested in their discipline. Thanks to my conviction that God is the way and the truth and the life, I never questioned the significance of the love of truth as a way to a meaningful life. When my classmates were busy with their second major in economics or looking for a part-time job, I indulged myself in Heidegger, Max Scheler, Kierkegaard, Karl Barth, and Augustine. As you may notice from this short list, In those years, I was more interested in practical than in theoretical philosophy, in irrational existential concerns than rational reflections about reality. This has been quite normal among philosophy students in China, who are more eager to find directives for their earthly life journeys from philosophers than to train their rational minds by philosophizing. It is so because China does not have its own tradition of philosophy, at least not in the Western sense. Certainly, there is a known tradition of reflection on philosophical issues, such as the way of nature, nature and value, goodness and righteousness, which can be traced back to the period of Lao Tzu and Confucius. However, their primary and ultimate concern, as I mentioned earlier, was ethical and political thought. They lacked a pure love of truth for its own sake. They studied nature and talked about Tao or the way merely because these ideas would be useful for their moral teachings. Their utilitarian concerns prevented ancient Chinese thinkers from dealing with fundamental issues in a purely theoretical manner. The absence of transcendent being in Chinese spiritual life also leads to the poverty of philosophy. With this background, I left Beijing for the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. Following my interest in the practical dimensions of philosophy, I chose Augustine's conception of voluntas or will as the topic of my PhD dissertation. In Leuven, I received a more rigorous training and came to appreciate the powerful rational arguments found in figures like Thomas Aquinas. With a close reading of Augustine's discussions on human freedom and its psychological foundation, I realized that the strength of his thought was not only in its emotional power and rhetoric excellence, but also in the powerful arguments we can reconstruct from his insights. I also noticed that Augustine's philosophical insights into human life in these later theological debates had been unjustly ignored. Even philosophers in the Western world paid little attention to his achievement in the Pelagian controversies. This discovery strengthened my preference for philosophy over theology as my vocation. First of all, as a believer in the Catholic faith, I do not think that there is an essential difference between the truths in these two disciplines, even though some revealed truths are not accessible to our natural reason in this world. Moreover, it is easier to persuade non-believers to accept Christianity with philosophical arguments than with theological doctrines. For philosophy displays the powers of human rationality, as well as its innate limitations. This is especially significant for people living in a secular age, which views all things in these worldly terms. Philosophy is still cherished as one of the highest forms of rationality that guides us in this life. If one can, shall I continue? Yeah. If one can combine a powerful rational thinking with a sincere faith, this will eloquently demonstrate the superiority of Catholic faith and leave a strong effect on non-believers. Though philosophical learnings alone cannot convert them, I believe that it paves the way for abiding faith. In 2007, I returned to my alma mater, Peking University, to teach ancient and medieval philosophy. I have deliberately focused on Aristotle and Aquinas, rather than on Plato and Augustine. Even though the latter are more popular in China because of their expressiveness and emotional power. I believe that with patient analysis from the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, Chinese students can obtain a strict training in rational argumentation, which they cannot find in ancient Chinese thought. I decided to adopt this indirect manner of witnessing my faith, because as Father Matteo Ricci and Michele Ruggieri showed, we should be patient to propose Christianity to people with such an ancient and strong tradition. Nowadays, there are many Protestant Christians adopting a direct way of evangelization. They approach people on the street or on the campus and try to bring them to their house church. This approach is successful in some cases, but not always, especially with people who have a strong sense of self-consciousness. Last month, one of my students visited Yale University and met some Christians there. He's a very intelligent person and quite interested in the Western culture and its Christian background. He visited some church with his American Christian friend. Then they prayed in front of him and talked a lot about their personal experience of miracles. However, this simply made him uncomfortable and fearful. and he wrote to me to see how he could get away from them without offending them. I just told him these people did not mean any harm. They were simply to ensure the ethic. He did not need to be afraid. If God does not exist, he will be of no harm at all. If he exists, he will be benevolent and merciful as we find in the Bible. As I mentioned earlier, China has a long history of secularity and is now moving into a globally secular age. It is very hard for ordinary people to fully understand what Christians teach about a transcendent being or the significance of religious experiences. We should be patient to introduce them to this way of life. The first step is the hardest. At the very beginning of my career, only few students came to my courses on medieval philosophy, especially those on Aquinas. In contrast, my courses on ancient Greek philosophy, especially those on Plato, proved to be much more popular. To be honest, I was a little bit discouraged at that moment and thought about focusing more on ancient philosophy to attract more students. For without students, I could achieve nothing. Moreover, the academic world is not an ivory tower, but also a place of fame and gain. I was seduced as well by this Vanity Fair, especially the popularity among students. It is difficult not to be moved when lecturing in front of hundreds of students. I hesitated and prayed. Here I must mention my wife, Hui Hui, who gave me a definite answer by her personal choice of church history in the Middle Ages as the subject of her PhD thesis. An even less popular topic. Then I knew that I should not ask that this cup may pass me by. If I were to give up the efforts of promoting medieval philosophy, my students would lose a good chance to see how reason and faith could blend as well as milk and water in such an unjustly neglected period. I organized with my wife a reading group of Aquinas' Summa Theologiae. With some work of advertising, we managed to gather 12 students to meet every 2 weeks to read carefully his subtle analysis as found in his account of human nature. Meanwhile, my medieval courses also attracted almost the same amount of students. They primarily came for reading classics. Though China does not have a strong tradition of philosophizing, it established a long tradition of classics. from very early on, Chinese people showed great respect for the classics in their traditions. This love of classics is also evident in the research on Western philosophy in China. The Department of Philosophy should better be called the Department of History of Philosophy. Thanks to this historical approach to philosophy, Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas, Duns Scotus have been treated as an essential part of philosophy rather than theology. Moreover, some Chinese scholars have realized that it was wrong to separate Western democracy and science from its religion. They exhorted younger generation to read more about the Western tradition of religion. They believe that without adequate understanding of Christianity, it would be hard for us to find a way out of the emergent status in a globalized context. Their ultimate concerns are secular. But their enthusiastic promotion of Christian classics paves the way to the truth itself. The students of our reading group therefore came for classics, not for philosophy nor for Christianity. Gradually, they came to recognize the value of doing philosophy in a rational way. This encouraged me to bring more philosophical texts with stronger theological background. Like Aquinas' discussions of the identity of the human soul now and in the afterlife, I carefully de-theologized the text by relating it to our reflection on personal identity today. However, this purposeful distinction of theology and philosophy did not dispel, but rather aroused their interest in the theological context. It surprised them that today we could still learn from theological texts of the so-called Dark Ages. They became eager to know more about their theological background. In order to know more precisely about the point of the argument. Now I'm no longer so naive as I was in the high school to believe that this sort of talk can bring a lost sheep back to its flock. But I could feel during my conversations and my discussions with my students that a seed had already been planted in their hearts, which will help them face the challenges and opportunities of this secular age. Before ending my story, I want to mention that I do not think that this theoretical approach is the only way to the way and the truth and the life. as I once believed as a high school student. I lay an unusual stress on it simply because I take it as a way that has its unique strength in this secular age. When I wholeheartedly embraced the Catholic faith and the ceremony for my grandfather, I believed that this would first of all entirely change the way of my life. Not only my understanding of the world and myself. My grandfather left a red-colored notebook, which is a fruit of his life work being a medical doctor. On its flyleaf, I found these words: "Preach holiness in thought, word, and deed." I hold this to my heart. I always hope to affect people around me with my deeds as well as my words. Last year, I became a counselor or tutor for undergraduate students. I was assigned to take care of 56 freshmen admitted to the Department of Philosophy in the last year. I had a good chance to live with these kids who just left their parents for university life. They were excited as well as confused in this new life. The campus on which we are living belonged to the Yanjing University before 1949. Yanjing University was the most successful church-run university in China, whose motto was "Freedom through truth for service." In my approach to the truth, I always try to be patient for the service of my students. I spent a lot of time listening to their stories, sharing their joys and sorrows. I accompanied them to the hospital at midnight. We also climbed a mountain in the weekend. They are quite different from my classmates of 15 years ago. Thanks to the economic growth, some of them came from solid middle-class families and care less about the secular concerns, such as the payment for a future career. Though not many, some of them do show their interests and capacities in the theoretical approach. One of them even came to my reading group of Aquinas Summa. I do not hide my belief, but I do not want to force it on them. I hope that they can feel the need to read the Holy Scriptures as a result of their own philosophical thinking. I believe that one needs to find his own way to follow God. I just want them to take me as a smiling, sincere person whom they can rely on when in need. Without my knowledge, they made a very moving video for me and helped me win the title of a privileged title of best counselor or tutor. I believe that God has His own way for the liberation of my students, as well as all my fellow men in China. All I can do is to do my best in service and be patient. This is a difficult time. This is also an exciting time. The secular age offers great challenges as well as great opportunities. We should be patient with faith, hope, and love. Grazie.
Ringraziamo.
Thank you.
Ringraziamo.
Thank you very much to our friend Tianyue. Thank you very much to our friend Tianyue. Now, very briefly, to conclude, let me highlight some pearls of what you said, not to lose them. First of all, starting from the idea of being aware that we are all part of a secular society, I think we should learn from you how to get around in a secular society. And this is, to him, an invitation to respond. In his work, in his society, in the people he meets, Tianyue sees the desire to communicate the sense of life and death. And in Tianyue's vision, this sense is given by faith. And then he uses an indirect method, starting from working on sight instead of doing proselytism. I'm also an expert in medieval philosophy. You know, starting from philosophy to communicate faith means starting from reason. As Father Giussani said, faith is like the flower that blooms at the apex of reason. I think you've had a similar experience to mine when I met Tianyue, a man who was unknown to me from a distant country, but I immediately felt he was very close to me. Thanks very much.